Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. On most Tuesdays, I also upload a Technique Tuesday video, which is a very specific technique-focused video. Well, this is a podcast in which I discuss my knitting life in the past week. In all of my videos, I include direct links down in the video description that allow you to jump from topic to topic. So I have a few things I want to talk about this week. I want to talk about stalking people in public who are wearing interesting knitwear. Finish it February. My current knitting project, and as well as some books related to that project that you might find interesting. And then I want to talk about this vintage Roaring 20s sweater that I am going to be working on this year, and how it's related to a sporting goods company. So let's get started. So it's winter, which means I don't go out much. And when I do go out, I notice that a lot of people are wearing knitted items. And so I tend to kind of just be attracted by knitwear when I'm in public. So we were standing in the self-checkout line. There's 4 different registers for self-checkout, but there's one line. And so we were a couple of people back in line, and I saw this woman at the register was wearing an interesting hat, and she was like 15 feet away from me. So I was trying to see the stitch pattern was very distinctive on the hat. And then I was trying to get a good look at the ribbing. I thought it was probably machine knit, but I wasn't 100% sure. And I was just, something to keep myself occupied when I'm in public. If I'm at a theater and the person in front of me is wearing an interesting sweater, I'll study that as well. But what was funny was that we got to our register, and then I couldn't see the woman in this pink hat, interesting hat, so I didn't know what happened to her. So we are scanning all of our items, and we're starting to load. We finished that, and we're starting to load them back up in the cart. And a woman comes up to us. She stands between me and my husband, and she says, "I just wanted to tell you, I love your hats. They're just beautiful." We're like, "Oh, thank you." And of course, because I knit them, I said, "I'd like to let people know." And so I was like, "Oh, I knit them myself." And she said, "I know, I'm a knitter. I just love everything about them. The beautiful stitch patterns, and I love the yarns, just everything about it." And then she walked away and she disappeared. She was a employee. She went into a back room. And my husband said to me, "Well, that explains what was going on earlier." She said, "When we were in the back of the store, she was staring at me, and I couldn't figure out why she was staring at me. And it turns out she was staring at his hat, and she was trying to get a good look at it." So I just thought that was funny so here I was stalking these people in public, and I was being stalked at the same time. February is in just a couple of weeks, and so in February I like to go through all of my unfinished objects, my UFO pile, and then evaluate it. Is this something that I actually want to see completed? Is this something I don't care about? Is this something I want to toss in the trash? Do I want to return it back to my stash just as it is and as available yarn? What do I want to do? So this year, no, I don't really have very many. I didn't think I had very many, and I have looked, and I don't have very many unfinished things this year. I think it's because last year I knit a lot of big projects. I knit sweaters, and that really took up a lot of my time, instead of doing a lot of little projects, where if I'm doing a lot of projects, some of them are going to get put to the side. But I really didn't have that many. One of the things that I knew, I didn't have to dig it out because I've been keeping it on the floor of my office next to my desk to remind me of it, is a pillow that I started knitting for my daughter last summer. She graduated from college a year ago, and then in the spring she she moved to Chicago and got her first post-college apartment, and wanted to decorate it. And I had this pillow form in my office, and I said, "Oh, I could knit you a pillow if that's something you wanted." And so we found a stitch pattern. The problem was the pattern was written for a certain size pillow. which if I was starting without a pillow form would have been fine, because then I could have knit the pillow and then gone and bought the pillow form. But I had the pillow form and I had a pattern that was written for different size pillows. So I had to adjust it. So this pillow has 2 stitch patterns. The back of the stitch pattern is just, I think it's like it must be a slip stitch pattern. I don't even remember. Yeah, it's a slip stitch pattern. So it's just a basic slip stitch pattern for the back of the pillow. And then the front of the pillow has that stitch pattern plus a different one, which is kind of a brioche pattern, and which you can see right here. I was looking at what the pillow said the gauge was for one of the particular stitch patterns. I don't think they gave gauge for both of them. They gave them for one of them. And so the assumption is if you get the correct gauge for that one, then using the same size needles, you should get the correct gauge for this other stitch pattern. So I had to scale up or down the pillow to a stitch count that was going to work and create the pillow that I needed for my daughter. So I just used the proportions that they had for the part of the pillow that had both stitch patterns, and I knit the 2 pieces, and I never really paid much attention to the sizing. And it turned out that when I was going to sew them together, you can see that they're just not the same. I mean, they're not, well, the brioche is pulling things up, so they're just not the same at all. And so I have to go back and figure out how to make this work. But at least now I have a giant gauge swatch that I can use to inform me as to how many stitches I actually need of each of the 2 stitch patterns. So actually I'm not sure which one doesn't fit they're not the same size, and I think at least one of them fits the pillow. So I have to figure out which one. So I have to reknit this, and there was a mistake that I had seen that I had made pretty far down right here, which you can see it on camera, I think pretty easily. You see that kind of horizontal line. It's easy to see in a photo or on camera. It's really hard to see in person. And my daughter didn't care about it, so I left it in. I didn't rip all the way back and reknit it, but now that I have to knit one piece or the other, I'll probably be reknitting this one anyway, and so then I can correct that mistake. So this is the main thing that has been sitting in my pile since last summer, and that I need to address in February. The second thing is the sweater I'm currently working. I'm halfway done with it, and it may bleed into February, but I'll make sure I get it done in February. Then I have one other thing, and I'll be showing that to you in the next couple weeks. It's something that I actually designed yesterday morning. So sometime in the next couple of weeks, I'll show you my notes and pictures and how I went through a design process for a pair of mittens that have to be completed on February 1st. And by completed on February 1st, I don't mean completed by February 1st. I mean that I have to knit most of it before February 1st. And then on February 1st, I'm going to this group where we are going to be completing these items using some really special yarn, and that can't leave their site. Like, they can't give it to us and then we leave with it. We have to be using this yarn under supervision, and then we give the items to them. So I'll be telling you more about that in the next couple of weeks. But those are really the 3 knitting projects that I have. It's not that much to try to get done for February. So what I have decided, because I have this goal of spinning more, of doing more hand spinning, and that is a larger goal of being able to spin well enough to get the yarn I want for a specific project I have in mind, for any given specific project. In order to do that, though, I just need more practice spinning and just get used to it and just do it on a more regular basis. And so my goal for this year was to just commit to spinning 15 minutes every day. I have this this one-page annual calendar. And so every day that I spin for 15 minutes, I do a big red X through it. And that visual reminder to spin is really helping me. I've been keeping it on my desk. I'm trying to keep it on top of everything on my desk to just visually remind me, because it's very easy for me to just walk by the room where my spinning wheel is and not think about doing it, or thinking to myself, oh yeah, I have to remember to spin today, and then not do it. But if I have that visual reminder to do this, then I've actually been doing it. I have missed a few days, and that's fine with me, because overall I am spinning on most days, and some days I'm spinning, half an hour or more, because I'm just feeling like I'm in the mood to spin. So I'm achieving that daily goal that I have, which is ultimately going to help with a larger goal that I have in mind. So because I have this goal of spinning more, and I am spinning more, and I don't have that many unfinished knitting projects to work on in February, my plan is to add a spinning project to my Finish It February. I'm not sure what that means. I don't know if that means spinning a certain amount of fiber, or if it means taking some fiber from unspun state all the way to finished knitted object. I don't completely know what that means yet. I have to see how my spinning goes, because I don't really know how fast a spinner I actually am. I don't know what's possible for me to do, but it certainly could make me ramp up the amount of spinning I'm doing every day. So this is the sweater I've been working on for my daughter. I'm just at the point, she wants it a little bit short, so I'm just at the point where I'm about to transition to the ribbing at the bottom. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I'm constructing this sweater, because when I began the sweater back in November, I wanted a top-down sweater that was knit with set-in sleeves. So you work the sleeves simultaneously with the rest of the body, just like you would with a raglan sweater, only you're not starting, you're not sort of moving out from the center. You're starting from these shoulders, and you're moving forward this way and backwards that way, as well as at the same time creating these sleeves. So I was using a technique that was first created or described by Barbara Walker in 1972 in her book, Knitting from the Top. So it's this book right here. I wasn't happy with the results. Let me just show you. So this is the original start. When I have to start something completely over, I don't rip it all out and start over. I just start over with new yarn, so it doesn't depress me too much to have nothing to show for my work. So the way this sweater was worked is that you cast on for all of the stitches across the back, and then you do shoulder shaping on each side. And then in Walker's method, you pick up stitches across the front of the shoulder and work those, do the shoulder shaping for that. And then you come back over to this side, you pick up stitches along this shoulder, knit down for an inch or two, do the shoulder shaping for that. And then the idea is that you work across, you pick up stitches to form the top of the sleeve cap, work all the way across, pick up stitches for the sleeve cap, and then work across that front. And then you're going back and forth. So that's how it worked. I didn't like the increases that I had selected along the side here. And then there's this, and it was the same increase I was using for the sleeves. And that increase was adjacent to a slipped stitch sort of seam line that was right here. And I just didn't like the combination of everything. So I wanted to start over. So if you look at the shoulder of the original sweater, I didn't particularly like this transition from the stockinette to the purl. And I had to short row it in here where the cables are. And then I was starting these closed cables. I just didn't like how that looked. When I was trying to decide what to do, somebody mentioned cocoknits, which is Julie Weisenberger's sort of designer name. This technique is worked from the top down, but it has some really very different ways of approaching the top down process. So you start with the number of stitches you need for the back of the neck. And then you increase every row at each side of the shoulder, every row. So you're not doing every right side row, you're doing every row, you're doing increases. And you're using a lifted increase, which kind of creates a bit of tension along here. It's not usually advised to use lifted increases like that, but there's a specific reason why that works here. You do these increases until you have the number of stitches you need for your shoulder. And so all of the shoulder shaping is done in the back. So essentially it's a much steeper angle than you would have if you were doing the shaping on both shoulders. And then you pick up stitches along here. You pick up the number of stitches that you need for your shoulder, and you knit until you have the width that you need for your sleeve cap. So you're knitting back and forth, and you do that on each of the right shoulders. And then you pick up the stitches that you need. You come across the one front, you pick up the stitches you need for here, and then you're working across the back, you pick up the stitches on the other side. And the other thing that's different about the way she does this is that the method that she uses for picking up stitches is really unusual. I've never seen something like that. But the combination of the method that she uses to pick up stitches and this particular set of increases, these create they're slightly stretchy, but they're very sturdy. This is the part of the sweater where the entire weight of the sweater needs to be held up. And so by having these really sturdy construction bits right here, that keeps the sweater from stretching out and pulling out of shape. So that was the construction method I chose to use the second time around. The book I used to kind of figure out how to do this other construction process was Cocoknits Sweater Workshop, and it's by Julie Weisenberger. Now, this is not a design book. This is not a book that teaches you how to design using her method. So I understood how the Barbara Walker's top-down method worked, and I looked through a number of the patterns. These are all pretty simple sweater patterns to kind of introduce you to her method of sweater construction. And she's got tons of other sweaters on Ravelry besides the ones that are in here. But I use those as a guideline for understanding how does this process work. And she mentions in here that maybe her next book will be a book, a design book, how to design. But I found this really invaluable, and I really like the different, I just really like that those elements that are at the shoulder, both in terms of just the appearance. I really do like that look of the shaping only on the back. You'll see that a lot in commercial sweaters. There are some designers who incorporate that kind of shaping. Julie Weisenberger calls it the English tailoring. If you Google that, you can't really find anybody else who calls it that. I was trying for a long time to figure out why, in what context is it considered English tailoring. And I don't know if that refers to suit making and how different places would tailor suits with shoulders that are different. I don't know. But she comes from a design background. She's not a knitter who learned to design hand knits. She was a designer who knit, but she was originally designing, I think, commercial knitwear is what it sounds like. And then she decided to switch to designing for hand knitting. So she has a sort of a specialized background in design that caused her to approach things in a different way. So I thought that was interesting, this Cocoknits. I do really appreciate Barbara Walker's book in demonstrating how items that are traditionally worked in one direction can be worked in the opposite direction, and all of the work she did in figuring out these construction processes. Weisenberger's book is not a design book, but you can evaluate her patterns to understand how the processes worked, where Walker is not giving you patterns, but she's explaining to you how you calculate and figure out how to do things that you want to design yourself. So they come from very different places, but they both were really valuable to me in figuring out how to design that sweater. I spent most of last weekend trying to figure out how I was going to modify my next vintage sweater project so that it will retain the overall design and look of the piece, but so that it will fit me. And there were a lot of challenges to this because of all of the different working parts in the sweater. In some senses, this sweater is very simple. It starts at the back. You cast on the number of stitches for the back. You work up to the armholes. You cast on the number of stitches you need for the sleeves. You work those completely straight for a certain amount of the pattern, and then you bind off for the sleeves, and then you work the front. That it's a very simple shape. The sleeves have no shaping. They're completely rectangular. And the body is completely rectangular. And so it seems very simple. But then you look at the design that's laid on top of that, and you start to realize all of the moving parts. And so every time I came up with a solution, I would think, oh, this is what I'm going to do. And then I would be planning that, and then I'd realize where the flaw was in my idea. So essentially, they didn't give you any information about row gauge, how long it was, how many rows you needed to work. I had to figure out how many total rows there were in this pattern by going through the pattern line by line and charting everything out so that then I could see, well, how many rows did that end up being? And then I could divide by my row gauge and figure out the total length. And then I saw it's 3 inches too short. How am I going to add 3 inches to this pattern? So if you look at the design, the back, where you can see the front of the pattern, there are 4 stripes that have shapes in them that are particular colors. So you have red diamonds, you have blue V shapes, you have yellow triangles, and you have these black diagonal lines. So you have these 4 stripes, each different, going up the front. And then the sleeves takes 2 of those motifs and uses them on the sleeve. And what you'll notice is that the yellow triangle in the body is pointed upward like this, but on the sleeve is pointed downward. And the other thing about the yellow triangles is that on the body, they are lined up with the red triangles. They're centered with each other. But in the sleeve, the triangles are offset from each other. If you look back at the body again, you'll see the blue V's and the black diagonal lines are lined up with each other, and they're offset so that they are centered in between the red diamonds and the yellow triangles. So you have these 4 distinct patterns. They alternate so that they're offset from each other, and they're a specific number of rows long. So how do you add 3 inches? Well, the other issue I had was I was really concerned about the sleeve because it's about 10.5 inches in circumference from the wrist all the way up to the armhole. And so for the wrist, you don't want it any bigger than that because it's already bigger than your wrist, and it's going to be sewn to a cuff, and then which is going to cause some blousing, and then there's these slashes in the sleeves that help with the blousing as well. So you don't want it any bigger than that because then you get these giant blouse sleeves at the bottom, but you need it bigger up here. And so at first I thought, well, I could use those 3 extra inches in the sleeve. I'll just add one of the stripe patterns from the body, like the blue one. I'll just add that to the sleeve along with another plain stripe, and that will give me the 3 inches I need. But then I realized it would make the sleeve too big down here. I'd get enough room in the underarm, but it would be too big down here. So I have to keep the sleeve the same circumference, but I also have to figure out a way to provide more room in the underarm. So that meant I needed to add, because one of my ideas was, what if I just add an extra 2 rows to each stripe? And so I'm like, that would work. And well, then it makes the diamond or the triangle smaller in proportion to the stripe itself. So then I thought, well, but then I could enlarge each of those by an extra row, but then that crowds them in vertically. They would need to be more to space out. And then I realized I couldn't have the extra rows in the sleeve anyway because of the whole problem I just talked about. So finally I realized, okay, I just need the 3 extra inches in the body. How am I going to do that? So I add an extra stripe, but which one do I add and how do I do that and still keep this vertical business going that I need? So in the end, what I decided to do was shuffle some things around a little bit. And I'll show you right here what I did. So I moved the black diagonal line to the middle of the sweater. And then I moved the blue, I created another blue V stripe, and I put the first blue V stripe at the bottom of the sweater and the second one up at the top. And that keeps everything lined up the way it's supposed to be with alternating as the extra length I need. And I think it's going to work. So that's my plan. So when I'm figuring all this out, I'm essentially pre-knitting the sweater by charting it out. And this is something I do when I'm designing my own sweaters. I chart the whole thing out to really see get an overview of what it's going to look like. If I'm knitting somebody else's design, even if it's contemporary and I have schematic information and I have inch counts and all of that, a lot of times I'll lay out the whole sweater with all of the stitch patterns so that I can see where those stitch patterns, what's going to happen when it's time to, bind off for armholes, or what's going to happen when I need to increase this way or that way. And so I can plan ahead for how am I going to maintain a stitch pattern while also decreasing? How can I plan for that? And because I might want to do something different than what the designer has done, because the designer is creating something for multiple sizes. And in some cases, it may be much simpler for them. Like if you have a panel of lace or a panel of cables, that once you start decreasing, you just shift it all to stockinette. Just tell people, go to stockinette. Because there's too much variation in what size somebody could be knitting and what their row gauge differences are, you can never necessarily know what row of a pattern somebody's going to be on when it's time to do the shaping. So when you are designing for multiple sizes, sometimes you have to simplify things that don't necessarily give you as aesthetically pleasing a result as you could have if you were designing specifically for your size. Which is really interesting because so many all of vintage patterns, before a certain date are one size. And what this particular design has shown me is that this was designed for a very specific set of dimensions using knowledge about a very specific stitch and row gauge. And it isn't easy to modify. There's a lot of complications in order to change the sizing. And so in some ways it's easier to design for one size than it is for multiple sizes. So in this process, I'm basically going through the pattern line by line, reading every instruction, and then applying it to my chart. Well, the very first set of instructions for this pattern, I didn't need to chart, but I was a little curious about 2 things. So the pattern said to use 2 strands to cast on 85 stitches and knit 10 ridges, I think it said, of the garter stitch. And then it says, from then on, you will be using spalding stitch to knit the body of the sweater, which is knit a row and purl a row. In other words, it's stockinette. So just that first line of instruction caused me to have 2 questions. Number one, when do you drop the second strand of yarn? I've seen, like in Fisherman Ganseys, often they would have you cast on with 2 strands of yarn, but then you get rid of the second strand. It's just to make that cast on edge sturdier. So if something catches on it and you break one of the strands of yarn from being a fisherman or getting things caught on things, that you'd still have the other strand of yarn there to prevent the sweater from falling apart. So I was certain that the stockinette portion of the sweaters was knit with 1 strand. What wasn't clear to me is really when I was supposed to drop that second strand that I was using when I was casting on. Normally I would think, oh, you just drop it at the end of that cast on. But I wasn't 100% sure, and I thought, well, maybe they want you to work the garter stitch with 2 strands for some reason, but they're not saying that it was ambiguous. And a look through the rest of the patterns in that booklet show that almost every one of them that has a garter stitch border instead of something like ribbing, the garter stitch, it always says to cast on with 2 strands, and then it tells you at the end of the garter stitch hem then to drop that extra strand. So this particular instruction, that particular instruction got left out. But the second thing that really caught my attention was the fact that they were referring to stockinette as spalding stitch. So when I first came across this pattern last spring sometime, I think, and I saw them refer to this as spalding stitch, I Googled it. I thought, what is this? Why are they calling it that? And the only hits I got on Google were from other patterns by the same company. And so last week when I was talking about this is the sweater I'm going to knit, somebody in the Ravelry group, I think it was Imported is her name, she went and looked at the pattern and saw what is this with the spalding stitch? And she Googled too, and she noticed that there were actually some hits for some newspaper articles. They're like digitized articles that had been machine transcribed using what's called OCR, optical character recognition. So it's kind of a bad transcription, but you could see that the words spalding stitch were in there. And so she had found those. And when I saw that, I went, oh, I have a subscription to newspapers.com because I do family history research. So I went on to newspapers.com and I did a search for the term spalding stitch. And I found between 1915 and 1946, I could find articles that referred to them, but a lot of advertisements for sweaters. Sweaters using spalding stitch, there were different ads for that. And I'm like, why is it only contained within 1915 and 1946? And why were they calling it that? So eventually I thought, well, what if I searched not for spalding stitch, but for spalding, but the 2 terms spalding and knit. So then I got these hits for spalding knit. And so then I went back and Googled some more. And eventually I realized that they were calling these athletic sweaters. They were calling the athletic sweaters spalding sweaters. And so I thought, well, isn't there a sporting goods company called Spalding? And I looked it up, but that spalding was spelled differently. It was spelled spalding. But I thought, well, I'm going to look up spalding without a U, spalding stitch and spalding knit. And then I got a wider range of hits going all the way back to the 1890s, in which there was an ad for the A.G. Spalding Company advertising its sweaters. And so finally what I put together was that sometimes people were spelling it with a U, but the actual name of the sporting goods company was Spalding with just an ALD. So I started looking up, what is the Spalding Company? Well, it was started by a man named A.G. Spalding. He had been a professional baseball player in the 19th century for the very first professional baseball team. And then he started the National Baseball League and wrote up the rule books, credited Abner, did research to figure out who had even invented baseball and discovered that it was Abner Doubleday. And then he started a sporting goods company. And one of the things that they did was they bought this knitting mill out on the East Coast where they then manufactured all kinds of sporting goods, including athletic sweaters. So one of the things I learned a year ago when I started doing knitting vintage sweaters and researching them was that the term sweater referred to a garment in which you were sweating. So it didn't have to be knitted. It could be just wool flannel or something, but it would be something that would cause you to sweat or that you would wear when sweating. And that sweaters, as this type of garment, was called a sweater because it was used for athletic activities. So originally they would use that fine gauge knit fabric that was used for long underwear, and they were using those to create sweaters for athletics, where it was football or baseball or cycling or yachting or whatever it was. That's what they were originally creating these garments for, because they stretched and you could move while you were being active. Well, that fabric is also called Jersey fabric, from the Isle of Jersey, where this fine gauge stockinette fabric was manufactured. And so these things are also called athletic jerseys. So for whatever reason, it could be that in this country, Spalding was the first company that was making sweaters using stockinette fabric. And so that they became known as Spalding sweaters. And then it became known as Spalding stitch, even though it's stockinette and it's the stitch pattern used in socks and stockings. The process of knitting Spalding stitch when you're knitting a sweater flat is knitting a row and then purling a row, where if you're knitting stockings or socks, you're knitting in the round and you'll be knitting every round. So it makes me think that they were labeling these fabrics differently based on the process that was used to create them, not based on what the finished result looked like. But regardless, that term Spalding stitch or Spalding knit just carried through all the way into the 1940s. And after that, it's really hard for me to find any references to Spalding stitch. I can't find any Spalding stitch in newspapers.com after 1946. And anytime I look for Spalding without the U, there are a lot of ads for Spalding athletic wear. And so even if I try to search separately on Spalding and knit on the same page, it could be all different kinds of things. They continue to sell a lot of athletic wear and athletic equipment to this day. I more or less know why they started calling this Spalding stitch, but I'm not really clear on why people stopped calling it Spalding stitch. Like what was the impetus for calling it something else? I don't know. I'd be really curious if any of you know anything about this Spalding stitch, if you've ever heard of it or heard any of your relatives who are knitters talking about it. I'd be really interested to know. So I think it's clear that not only is sweaters an American term or a North American term, but that Spalding stitch would have been a term only used in the United States because it referred to a product that was produced by an American company. One of the other things that's kind of interesting about 1920s sweaters is at least the ones in the American booklets. And this particular booklet that I'm using, this Corticelli book, has a lot of tuxedo sweaters in it. And that seemed to be a very popular style here in the United States in the 1920s. And I'd be curious, so I'll show you a picture of what that style of sweater looked like. It's very basic, straight sweater, straight sleeves, usually garter stitch, didn't have to be, but the quality that made it a tuxedo sweater was that it had a collar that was, a few inches wide, like a shawl collar, but it wasn't wider. It wasn't like this kind of shawl collar that's wider here at the neck and then gets narrower because there's a V-neck. This was the edges of the sweater were straight down all the way, and this collar that flipped back followed the lines of the edges of the sweater all the way down. And then usually these sweaters, they used a lot of belts back in the 20s, and these tuxedo sweaters always had some kind of a belt or something to keep them so that they didn't fly open, so they kept them closed. And they were super, super popular. But I wonder, and they're called tuxedo sweaters because, I don't know if I've told you guys this, but somewhere in the late 19th century, in the UK, it became popular for men to start wearing these dinner jackets that didn't have tails. So the upper classes would dress for dinner and they would have these long tails to their suit coats. But somewhere in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, men, maybe it was young men, I don't know, started wearing these shorter dinner jackets and was considered more casual attire. And there was a wealthy American from New York City who was visiting the UK and really liked that style of dinner jacket. And, you know, it had those lapels, a lot of times they're in satin or something like that. And when he went back to the US, the area where, you know, the people of his, you know, upper class, they all hung out in this area called Tuxedo Park. And so he popularized that dinner jacket here in the United States, and it started being called a tuxedo. And so that the tuxedo became very popular in the early 20th century. And so then in the 1920s, women are taking some of their fashion cues from menswear, but this tuxedo style became very popular. And I'd be curious to know if it was as popular in the UK as it was here, this women's sweater style. And if it was what they called it, or if this was a really just purely American fashion, these tuxedo sweaters. I'd be curious about that. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.